That's it. So it's been already a week post the holidays. We met the day after last week. That was literally the day after. And now it's already a week later. So we're very much need to already integrate whatever we gained, however we grew, however closer to God we became over the holidays into regular life. Regular life, there's a value in regular life, but we want regular life to be a little bit higher. And as such, we need to take and like hold tight in our heart whatever we experience. So we should live on a higher level. That's, of course, the idea. Holidays are really important to give us that infusion, that burst, that higher space, so that then we can integrate it into our daily life. So we were discussing last week the tragedy of the Hashmonaim. What was happening as they did not stick with the God that their parents or grandparents had sacrificed their lives for, and how quickly everything deteriorated into this absolute tragedy, tragic mess, tragic disaster. Something we wouldn't imagine Jew to Jew what we're hearing here. So just to remind you where we were up to and continue from that point, we discussed how Yochanan Horkanus, who was the son of Shimon. So Shimon was the last of the 5 original Maccabees, the sons of Matisyahu, the high priest, possibly. In some situations viewed as a high priest, perhaps he was, perhaps he wasn't, but definitely a very noble priestly family. So the Hashmonaim started out very noble priestly family, and then they became the warrior family that saved the Jews after some 27 years of fighting. So the last one was Shimon. Shimon, as we know, kept the throne, which was that tragic mistake, lost his life to his son-in-law. His son, Yochanan Horkanus, took over, was generally very righteous. We said the last months of his life lost it, became a complete Tzeduki, which is so crazy because this is exactly what his father and brothers and grandfather gave their lives for, fought against the Hellenist Tzeduki. It's the same concept. And yet he, at the end of his life, became this Tzeduki to such a degree that he was murdering out the sages. We said after he passed away, he had said that his wife should rule, but his son did not listen. His oldest son, Yehuda Aristobulus, he took over. He imprisoned his brothers, and he became the ruler. We said he was very sickly. He ruled only for about a year. And then when he passed away, his widow freed the brothers and married the oldest brother, Yannai, through the concept of Yibum. We were in the middle of discussing Yannai's rule. That's where we left off last week. And we said Yannai had a lot of, as we'll call it, Tzeduki leanings toward not wanting the traditional road, not wanting the what he would call control of the sages. He understood the sages probably weren't so fond of him. His father, at the end of his life, had turned completely Tzeduki and massacred the sages. He had a lot of Tzeduki leanings also. But you have to understand, the Tzeduki and the Hellenists is like the same concept. The concept is, unfortunately, it's so sad that when the Jews became more wealthy and more powerful, they didn't want to be under God anymore. They wanted to, like, a lot of them maybe had this sense, like we speak in the Torah. There's a verse that says, my strength, my power created for me this wealth. Meaning, wealth is a very great challenge. We ask God that he should bless his people with lots of wealth. It's a blessing, and we ask God for that blessing, and we want that blessing. And we understand poverty is a very great challenge as well. So we're looking for the challenge of wealth and not the challenge of poverty. But we do see historically that unfortunately when people became comfortable and successful and prosperous and powerful, they started looking outwards. They started feeling, I don't need to be under God's yoke. I mean, I'm so successful, not like God's giving me this success, but I'm so successful, so like, what do I need God for? Maybe if I needed him, but I don't need him, I'm very successful. It's very strange. Well, what do you mean you're successful? God's the one that gave you that success. So we called them Hellenists in the previous generation. Hellenists, they had these Greek aspirations. Now we're going to call them Tzedukim, following, as we said, Tzadok, Tzadok, and Bitus, who are basically saying, what do we need the oral law for? We just can look at the 5 books and do what we want. But it's, in essence, the Hellenists and the Tzedukim is the exact same concept. It's people that are saying, I want to do it my way. I don't want to be enslaved, limited to God's laws. So I'm going to throw off his yoke. I mean, I can afford to. I'm powerful. I'm wealthy. I don't need it. And what actually was developing at this point, therefore, was this tremendous rift between the average populace, we might call common man, the majority of the Jewish people, who were loyal to God, loyal to the sages, loyal to the commandments, and this small elite, people that hung around the palace with all the intrigues of the palace and power of the palace and wealth of the palace, that were, they wouldn't call themselves Hellenists, because of course that's passé to say since we kicked out the Assyrians, but in essence the same thing. Now we're calling them Tzedukim. It's in essence the same thing. We don't need God. So the Hellenists were throwing away Judaism entirely and absorbing the Greek idolatry. The Tzedukim don't officially throw away Judaism. They're just doing it however they want. The 5 books and we're good to go. Oral tradition, no. The sages, no. Teachers, no. We're self-made men. We're going to do it our own way. So they might say they weren't Hellenists at all. They're not idolaters. But in essence, they're not following God's will. This is the modern day Hellenists that now have a new name, but the same concept, the Tzedukim. Of course, in our generation, we have them as well. They might not be called Tzedukim, they might not be called Hellenists, but we recognize them as well. So obviously, this is a perpetual challenge. And here, the challenge is that God's giving you blessings, that God's making it easier, that God's making you prosperous, that God's making you successful. What blessings! And within those blessings, we need to recognize God. It's interesting because this week we're in the Torah portion of Noach. Of course, Noach, there was a flood. 40 days and 40 nights it rained, but the flood actually lasted a complete year, a complete solar year, which is even longer than a lunar year, meaning the world was covered in water for an entire year. The waters of Noach are compared to like the waters of a mikvah. Just as a mikvah, this ritual pool has to be the measurement of 40 sa'ah. So too, the waters rained for 40 days. So what is the idea of a mikvah? A mikvah is the idea of complete immersion. The word in Hebrew to immerse in a mikvah, litbol, has the same letters, if you just switch them around, as the word for nullification, bitul. So this complete immersion, if you can envision someone in a mikvah, in this ritual pool, completely covered by the waters, completely immersed by the waters. These waters are symbolic of God's knowledge, completely nullified to God. That was what this world was going through. So in a sense, it was very harsh. The waters of Noah, the waters of this mabul, this torrential downpour that washed away the planet, was a destructive force, a punitive force, but it was also a nullification to God force. It was also a rejuvenation force. And we're told that these torrential waters are like what we go through in this world trying to make a living. That we have the enslavement, the yoke of our finances. That could be a different type of subjugation that we could be under. That's sort of the classical example of the pressures and tensions and fears of exile is all of the difficulties in creating a living. So there is that normative difficulty in creating a living. At the same time, as you are challenged in creating a living, this helps you remember God and turn to Him and ask Him for His help. In every situation, there's always those people that rise to the top and that are successful. And what we're seeing here historically is that those successful people have a different type of challenge, not letting their success obscure their nullification to God. Remember, we said the waters of the flood are like the waters of a mikveh, the ritual pool, are like the waters of nullification to God. So when we lose it, and we lose that concept of the nullification to God, when we lose the stresses of finances and we become financially prosperous, it's a tremendous challenge. Now, thank God in our generation, many people are financially prosperous and do remember God and do serve God, and God should send all of us much, much, much financial prosperity. And God, don't worry, we'll remember you, we'll serve you, we'll be very loyal. But we do see historically it was a tremendous challenge. So this is what we have happening in the days of Yannai and throughout the period of the Hashmonaim. We have this sort of slice, the small slice of people that became wealthy, powerful, and were very enmeshed in the powers and monies and intrigues of the palace. And then we had the common populace, common man, who was very disgusted with what was going on, very disgusted. And he was like, you know, he was for God and for the sages and for serving God faithfully. So there was a lot of friction here between Yannai the king and the population, and between Yannai the king and the sages. And Yannai felt and understood, as we said, that the sages didn't like him. If you remember, we said that his Tzeduki, so-called friend, there was this false rumor going around about Yannai's mother had been violated, had been taken before he was born. This was a rumor that was going on its own. His Tzeduki friend said, oh, the sages created this rumor to dispose of you, which made him say, no way, this is what the sages are doing. I'm a Tzeduki, and he started murdering the sages. We discussed how it came to this point where he had a meal and nobody could even lead the grace after meal until his wife, who was also the sister of the head of the tribunal court, the Sanhedrin, brought out her brother, Shimon ben Shattach, to lead the grace after meal. And we said this began the thawing of relationships. That was exactly as far as we got. So at this point, Yannai realizes that he needs the sages. If he doesn't have the sages, he doesn't have Torah, he doesn't have Judaism. Meaning, unlike even though I said the Tzedukim and the Hellenists are very similar, they are, but the foundational difference is the Hellenists were throwing away Judaism completely and becoming idolaters. The Tzedukim were throwing away, we'd call it Orthodox Judaism, traditional Judaism, Judaism with the oral tradition, but they still viewed themselves as Jews, and as such they knew Judaism had to continue. So Yannai understood that the only way Judaism would continue is if the sages were around and were teaching and were leading the people. So he sort of begrudgingly, after this whole incident that happened with the blessing after the meal, said, all right, like, whatever, we'll let the sages be. I guess we need them. I don't like them, and honestly, they don't like me, but we'll let them be. So at this point, Shimon ben Shattach, whose sister is the queen, so he has a little bit of a better position than anyone else. It was still, of course, quite precarious. He said, wait, we got to bring Torah back to the Jewish people. It's not just that Yannai forgot the laws. It's not just that Yannai's court forgot the laws. Everyone forgot the laws. Because here the sages were so persecuted. Everyone was tortured and murdered or in hiding or fled Israel. So everyone forgot. Nobody remembered how to serve God. We got to bring back Torah education. And he started the first, what we would call public school system that the world probably ever knew. All across Israel, he created schools we'd call chadarim, schools for little boys from age 6 and older, that these boys should be educated to be good Jews, to be knowledgeable Jews, to be able to serve God, which was such a tremendous, like, revolutionary concept that until that time, basically, the father officially was supposed to teach his son Torah. And if the father wasn't capable or didn't have time, didn't have the knowledge, didn't have the skills, didn't have the patience, he could hire someone. And that was basically how the Jewish people learned Torah definitely from the beginning of Torah until now. They learned it from their father, and they learned it as much each person as his situation allowed. And Shimon ben Shattach said, that's not good enough anymore. It's not good enough for each person to do as much as their situation allows. No way. We need the Jewish people to know Torah. We need the Jewish people to live Torah. So we are going to pour our resources, because this was a public school. This was free. Until now, the father had the responsibility, but these Jews were poor. If they couldn't do it themselves, they didn't have the money to hire someone else. So we have to create a situation where every single Jewish child will have the ability to learn. And this is how we're doing it, by these public schools, which didn't seem to cost that much less if we would look back at the figures. But, of course, allow people who would not have been able to afford anything to have an education. Absolutely free. This was a tremendous, tremendous, tremendous accomplishment of Shimon ben Shattach, restoring Torah to the Jewish people. So that was good. But life still wasn't good for Yannai, because Yannai was a very conflicted Tzadduki. As we're saying, he aligned himself with the Tzadduki philosophy. He viewed himself as a Tzadduki. He knew for the sake of his nation, he had to allow the sages to be around and do their thing, but he didn't like them. So, as I said, he was very conflicted. He's like tolerating the sages, but really trying to show that his allegiance is to the Tzaddukim. So what happened that brought the whole matter to a head? It was Sukkot. Now Yannai, again, he's the most noble person from the family of the Hashmonaim. He's the king. He's the oldest surviving son of Yochanan Harkness, because Alexander Aristobulus, who was older than him, died. So he is the high priest. Now this might sound very far-fetched to you. Why in the world would someone who doesn't care that much about God be the high priest? But in those days, there was this passion, this desire to be the priest. And as you serve God, though perhaps not how we understand it, but on some level, I also want to be the high priest. I think it's so cool to be the high priest. You think it's cool to be the high priest? Oh, well, I better run ahead of you, because I'm getting my application to be the high priest before you come along. So even people who really didn't seem to have passion for Hashem, passionately wanted to be the high priest. So it's Sukkot. Yannai, the king Tzadduki, is now, as the high priest, doing the very special ceremony of the Sukkot holiday, which is called Nisuch HaMayim. All year round, every single day, we pour a libation of wine on the altar. And the holiday of Sukkot, we pour water. We pour wine too, but the focus is on the special new thing we pour, which is water. What did the Tzaddukim do? They didn't take the water and pour it on the altar. They took the water and poured it on themselves, on their feet. Well, that sounds pretty innocuous. Sounds pretty innocuous, not at all, on myriads of levels. First of all, it was a complete affront to the thousands of Jews that are there gathered in the temple, watching the ceremony, and the ceremony is being completely violated. And this is Sukkot. So you know what the people did? They took their esrogim, right? They have the esrog, and they started pelting Yannai, the king, with their esrogim. They were stoning him with their esrogim. He viewed this as what it was, a rebellion against him. And he had, if you remember, we said he had a mercenary army, a hired army of primarily Gentile soldiers that he utilized the monies of the country to waste a tremendous amount of money on this Gentile army, this army of soldiers that was conquering for him. So he had taken this army of soldiers and positioned them right around Israel. Not inside, but he was thinking something might happen. Therefore, we see that he had them ready. The something happened. He poured the water on his feet, not on the altar. The people responded and pelted him with their esrogim. He responded by calling his army, and his army massacred 6,000 Jews that day. 6,000 Jews were massacred. for having the audacity to pelt the king with their esrogim. Now, obviously, there's a lot of spiritual, deep things going on here. Why was he pouring the water on his feet and not on the altar? So Hasidic thought explains that this idea of the pouring of the water is like this, it's tasteless. You don't even make a blessing on it when you drink it in some situations. So this water symbolizes that amorphous belief in God, not intellectually developed, just simple, basic belief in God. And that's what we're supposed to do on this holiday of Sukkot. We take our basic belief in God and pour it on the altar. This is our sacrifice to God. This is what we're offering up to God, our basic, pure, non-intellectualized, simple, absolute, all-encompassing belief in Him. The Tzedukim said, no, we don't pour that water on the altar. We pour it on our feet. Now, what did they mean by that? What they meant by saying they pour it on their feet is that the feet symbolizes the lowest levels of people. What the Tzedukim were saying was, oh, this water, this pure belief in God, unadulterated by any intellect, that's good for the feet. That's good for the common people, the feet of the Jewish people. You low people, yeah, like the communists say, religion, the opium of the masses. Yeah, for you common people, yeah, this is good stuff. For us, intellectual, higher level people, we don't need this water. But for you common people, we're throwing it on our feet. We're pouring it on our feet. So when the Tzedukim would take the water and pour it on their feet, they were giving a message. And the people responded by pelting him with their esrogim to say, no, even this esrog that is the best of the best because it has both the beautiful taste and the beautiful smell. No, even for this esrog, we need that water. So there was a lot of deep meaning in what both sides were doing. In the end of the day, brutality took over. And 6,000 Jews were murdered on that day. And it didn't end there. It didn't end there. Because Yannai now, it wasn't just the sages don't like me, but I'm tolerating them because I realize if I don't have them, we really don't have Torah anymore in the Jewish people, so I better sort of tolerate them. The people are rebelling against me. The people are pelting me, the king, with their esrogim. So he took his army. I told you on that one day, his army murdered 6,000 Jews. He took his army to attack the Jews. The Jews resisted. They were attacked. They resisted. They were attacked. This lasted for 5 years. For 5 years, there were these violent uprisings and violent attacks on the people by these mercenary soldiers. Again, Yannai's army was a high majority not Jews. It was a hired army, just like American history. The Revolutionary War, the Americans were generally not facing British soldiers. England had a mercenary army. They're basically Germans. So this is an old tradition. If you can't use your own people for whatever reason, hire an army. So these hired Gentiles were the tool that Yannai, this Jewish king, was using to massacre his own people, his own brothers, the Jews. He was using these Gentiles to murder his subjects, the Jews. And this happened for 5 years. And it erupted in a violent civil war. And the war went on for another 6 years. For 6 years, the Jews are fighting. The basic, pious Jews are fighting against Yannai. Over those 6 years, 50,000 Jews lost their lives. 50,000. Horrific number. We can envision 50,000 is horrific nowadays. Imagine what it was like then when the population was so much smaller. 50,000 Jews lost their lives, and I don't say by the hands of Jews, by the hands of Yannai's mercenary army. Finally, the Jews were so desperate, they sent a messenger to the Syrian king Demetrius, asking him to intervene, asking him for help in overthrowing Yannai. Now, of course, when the Syrian king got this message, he was very happy to come. But there was a little problem. I don't know if you remember, but we said that when originally, we're going back already a few kings ago, in making peace with the Assyrians, they had sent Jewish soldiers to the army. Now, in the Syrian army, and we said the Jewish soldiers were good. They were really good soldiers. They were really significant in the army. So the Jews who've been suffering now for years, right? We said it was 5 years. Is 5 years, and then it was 5 years, and then the went on now for another 6 years. So these Jews were appealing to the Syrian army. In the Syrian army, there were a lot of Jews. And the Jews, being loyal Jews, said to their commanders, we refuse. We're Jews. We're not going to go fight on Jewish soil as Syrian soldiers. So these Jews, it's such a tragedy because these Jewish soldiers thought they were doing a good thing. It's very interesting. As I said, when we look in history, we see a lot of very interesting lessons. So these Jewish soldiers thought they were doing a good thing. They thought they were being loyal Jews. They viewed it that the Syrian army is coming to take over Israel, and they're loyal Jews, and they're not going to fight against Israel, against the Jews, even though they work for the Syrian army. So with probably great courage and self-sacrifice, they said to their Syrian generals, we refuse to fight, and we're going to defect from your army. But really, what they were doing was a disservice to the Jewish people, because the Syrian king had been recruited by the Jews who had been murdered, 50,000 of them, by Yannai's foreign army. So the Jews had turned to the Syrian king, please help us. Obviously, there would have been a price to pay for the help, but please help us get rid of Yannai, who's murdering us. But the Jewish soldiers in the Syrian army said, we're not fighting against the Jews, we refuse. And since all his Jewish soldiers were defecting, the Syrian army turned back. Imagine the tragedy here. Everyone, the Jews in the Syrian army were being good, but they were wrong. You can sometimes think you're being really good, really courageous, self-sacrificing. You can get in big trouble. You're a soldier. A soldier has to listen to orders. So these Syrian Jewish soldiers were being really good, but they were really wrong. Because when the Syrian army didn't come, it just meant this cycle of persecution and violence. And again, it's not that the Syrian army were fighting the Jews. The Syrian army would have been fighting the mercenary army that Yannai had that was all Gentiles. So the Syrian army would have been fighting the Gentiles and would have freed the Jews who were under Yannai's persecution. But the Jewish soldiers in the Syrian army weren't up on current events. They didn't know the scoop of what was really going on. So they thought they were being good Jews. And in essence, what happened, obviously it's part of God's plan, he runs the world, but what happened was that the Jews languished and suffered under Yannai for many more years. It was another 10 years after this until Yannai died. And during a peaceful death. And during that time, more and more and more murders of the Jews happened under Yannai's command, through his Tzedukי people, his Tzedukי agents, through the mercenary army, because the Jews had had the chutzpah, had the audacity to try to get the Syrian army. He ordered mass murders. He gathered 800 sages and had them all murdered. as an expression of the slap he was giving the people for trying to get the Syrian army involved to help. And the sages realized that there's nothing we can do. We just got to wait this out. And Yannai ruled a total of 27 years. For 27 years, the people were violated and abused. The sages were in essence in hiding. And the Tzedukim were ruling, Yannai was ruling, the mercenary army was ruling, and it was a horrific time for the Jewish people. After 27 years, he dies. And now we begin the one beacon of light, the one good time in the entire Hashmona'i dynasty. Not surprisingly, the reason why it was a good time was because a woman was ruling. So just like his father before him, I don't know if you remember, but when Yochanan Horkinus passed away, he said his wife should rule. Interesting. He said his wife should rule. And we said his son, his oldest son, Yehuda Aristobulus, ignored his wishes, imprisoned his brothers, and he became the ruler. Now, again, Yehuda Aristobulus' next brother was Yannai. When Yannai passed away, he also said his wife should rule. But this time his sons, he had two sons, didn't start up. So the wife of Yannai, the sister of Shimon ben Shattach, who we've spoken of before, that she had worked to try to make some peace between her husband and the sages, Shlomo's Alexandra, she now becomes the queen. Now again, she was very, very righteous, as we understand. Her father-in-law was Yochanan Horkinus. When she got married to Yannai, her father-in-law, Yochanan Horkinus, was a very, very, very pious person. So obviously he picked a very pious daughter-in-law, a very pious wife for his son, Yannai, really for his son Yehuda Aristobulus, for his oldest son. She was originally his wife, and then she became Yannai's wife after he died. So she was a very pious woman, very close to her very special brother, Shimon ben Shattach, and she was given the throne. This was the only period during the entire very, very tragic time of the Hashmonaim where it was good for the Jews. It was very, very, very good. Now, unfortunately, I see this whole, I didn't realize I'm using a different Zoom account than the one we normally use. So it's not, I guess, a Zoom account for these types of meetings. So according to my computer screen, our meeting is going to end in 3 minutes. But let me just tell you, 3 minutes, at least something positive. We should end on a positive note because it wasn't so much fun until now. So basically, Shlomo's Alexandra, who sometimes called Shalom Tzion, called Solomon, there's lots of different names we see for historically. She ruled for about 8 years. It was an amazing time. It was an amazing time because she stuck with the sages. She did everything she could to take away all the negative Tzeduki influences and to restore peace to this people that have been savagely desecrated for the majority of the 27 years of her husband's reign. Savagely, brutally murdered and tortured and executed. And she restored peace. She took away the Tzedukim that had the power. She had an army, not a mercenary army, a regular army. It was only for protection. Again, this whole perspective of we need a big army and we're going to conquer, this is not a Jewish mindset. This is the mindset of the Gentile nations that the Jewish kings that are not being loyal enough to God are absorbing. When you're sticking with God's message, you think as God wants you to think. God's not interested in us pushing our borders. He's interested in us being secure, being safe, having a strong army to protect ourselves. But that's all we need. We have all the land we need. We have all the resources we need. It says during those 8 years, approximately, it's probably a little more than 8 years, of Shalom Tzion's reign, it rained bountifully, the earth was bountiful, the produce was bountiful, everybody had plenty, there was wealth, everyone had food and everything they needed Because they were listening to God. When you do it as God wants, it works. Shlomo Alexandra, was committed to doing it as God wanted, and it worked. I think my Zoom's going to break off in a minute, so I shouldn't be cut off in the middle of a sentence. I'll just end with this point. Just like Maimonides says, when you commit to doing what God wants, God gives you the good and takes away the bad, so you can truly serve him. And we see this in her entire 8-year reign. No bad, bountiful good, and the people are truly loyal. Unfortunately, with her passing, and even a little before her passing, it all crumbled again, and we go headlong into the complete tragedy of the end of the Hashmonai dynasty. But we have these brief 8 years where it worked. And why did it work? Because with this devout queen, the people clung to God, and when you're sticking with God, it works.